looking here at Chapter 14, and Chapter 14 is going to introduce us to the individual tax formula. So some of this we do need to update. There's always a few numbers that change with individual tax. This year we're going to see there's actually a few more than normal. So let's get started here. First start looking at our objectives. So the objectives include to determine an individual's filing status, to list the 4 steps for computing individual taxable income, to explain the relationship between the standard deduction and itemized deductions, to identify the impact of the QBI or qualified business income deduction on taxable income, and then to compute the regular tax on ordinary income. And we'll also look at explain why a marriage penalty exists in the federal income tax system, at least a couple of notes on it. We'll describe 4 important individual tax credits. We'll compute the individual alternative minimum tax. We'll at least look at that. I don't know how much we'll actually go into that, except to mention that there are some things that change if you are in a high income tax bracket. Then we're going to describe the individual tax payment and return filing requirements. So the first thing we start off with, and just like starting a return, looking at what is the filing status. So filing status means it reflects your marital and family situation, it affects calculation of taxable income, and determines rates at which income is taxed. We're going to see here one of the things that's going to make a difference is, are we married or are we not married? And what does that mean? Right, so being married means what are we on the last day of the year? So where it says last day of the year, that's what they look for as far as being married or not. So if I get divorced on December 29th, then I'm not married on the last day of the year unless I get remarried before. So if you're married on that last day of the year, you're looking at 2 options. You're either married filing jointly, right? So this means if your spouse incomes are similar, single rates generate lower overall tax. That's what they're talking about with the marriage penalty. In other words, I guess what I take from this, if I were you at this point, is if you're looking at being married or if the taxpayer is married, you either have the option of being married filing jointly or married filing separately. Right? So there may be some situations where being separate is going to give you a better tax return. Most of the time, it's going to be married filing jointly, but there are a few occasions. So that's a decision that taxpayers can make. You could be married filing jointly 1 year and married filing separately another year. And then there's this little part about here, if your spouse on the return passes away and you have a dependent child, you can still get the married filing jointly status for the next 2 years after the death of the spouse. So the year in which the spouse dies, you'll be married filing jointly because of that. And then 2 years after that, as long as there's a dependent in each of those years. And again, that's because most of the time married filing jointly is going to be better, but not a guarantee. So if they don't want to be married filing jointly, but they're married on the last day of the year, the other option is married filing separately. And there is a note here, it's not the exact same thing as being single. So kind of keep that in mind. So if you're not married on that last day of the year, you either head a household, so you're going to be a head of household if you have a dependent, or if you're going to be single if you do not have a dependent and you're not married. Let's look at some examples here. So determine Mr. J's filing status in 2021. So there's a lot of different scenarios here. Right, Mr. J and Mrs. J were divorced on November 18th. Mr. J has not remarried and has no dependent children. Right, so he's unmarried on the last day, has no children, looks like single to me. Mr. J and the first Mrs. J were divorced on April 2nd. Mr. J remarried the second Mrs. J on December 15th. He has no dependent children. So I guess he has a decision to make. He's married on the last day of the year, so he's either going to file his marriage filing jointly or married filing separately. Mrs. J died on July 23rd. Mr. J has not remarried and has no dependent children. Well, in this case, this is the same year in which Mrs. J unfortunately passed away. He's going to still be married filing jointly for this year. It's after this year that you look for 2 years if there's a dependent on the return. In this case, if he doesn't have dependents for the following years, that's when he'd go back to being single. Unless he gets married again. Mrs. J died on October 1st, 2020, so this is the year before. Mr. J has not remarried and maintains a home for one dependent child. Right, so he's within that 2-year limit, so he can still file as married filing jointly. Or surviving spouse, however you want to look at it. Mrs. J died on May 30, 2020. Mr. J has not remarried and has no dependent children. So that's the key difference. Now, in the year following, which is 2021, Mr. J goes back to being single. Mr. J and Mrs. J were legally divorced on May 30, 2016. Mr. J has not remarried and remains at home for 2 dependent children. But now he's past that 2-year lookout window. If they still are dependents, then he would be a head of household because he'd be considered unmarried on the last day of the year. So the choice would be either head of household with the dependents, which he qualifies for, or if there were no dependents, that would be when he'd be single at that point. So that starts us out looking here a little bit at the chapter and talking about the filing status and some examples here.